Jamar in Buffalo, thanks for waiting.
Hey, thanks. So I listen to your show a lot, and I always hear you talk about how morality is objective, how you can just objectively say something is wrong. But I don't see how for a while I believed that, but I'm starting to doubt that a lot. Like, how can you objectively say something is wrong?
Sure. So the objectiveness is about evaluating an act or the consequences of an action with respect to a goal. You could say that the goals are not objective, that they're subjective, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. Because if morality is going to mean anything, it has to relate to, as Sam Harris would say, well-being, or as I would say, something akin to well-being. It does no good to say, oh, morality is whatever I think it is or whatever my society thinks it is, because now you've defined it in a way that it could be anything. And so what I think that we tend to be talking about when we talk about right and wrong and whether something's moral or immoral is we're using linguistic shortcuts when the question we're really asking is, does this benefit us individually and as a species, or does this do harm for us? Does this increase our existence and our happiness and thriving and our general well-being, or does it diminish those things? If you look at the things that people specifically say, oh, this is moral or this is immoral, they're always about that.
Okay, but in some cases, like, you can think of anything, not anything, but you can think of a few cases where that can...
Yeah, but see, okay, here's the point of confusion. I apologize for interrupting you, but we're running short on time. As soon as you say in some cases, now we're talking about something different, because I am absolutely a proponent of situational morality, that every situation is different. When I talk about objective morality, I'm not saying there is a universal objective moral absolute that applies to every single situation. I'm saying within a given situation, there's a finite set of possible actions, and there's some set of one or more actions that represent the moral pinnacle for that situation, and some set that represents, moral or immorality. So, like, if you and I are sitting here having a conversation, it could be viewed as immoral for me to interrupt you, even if it's for clarification because we're short of time. It would definitely be immoral if I were just to scream a bunch of offensive, nasty things at you, and it would be more moral for me to, value you as a person, have a conversation, and try to get to some understanding. All you need for moral evaluations is to be able to compare the consequences of an action in a situation with other actions, hypotheticals. And because we're physical beings in a physical universe that has laws, there is no physical law that says if I chop off John's head, that's good for him. In every situation that we can conceive of, barring some, or virtually every situation, I'll say, cutting off John's head is not good for him. I would agree.
So like if your standard is it's harmful to society or harmful to a person or whatever,
yeah,
then how is like something, not saying I agree with it, but just for the sake of argument, having consensual sex with children, like say a 13-year-old and a 25-year-old decide to hook up and it's consensual, how is that immoral?
Yeah, so the thing is that 13-year-old can't actually give consent, because consent is a product of being adequately informed and comprehending the consequences of the action. And so generally we would view 13-year-olds, and we can go longer. Where we draw the line is somewhat arbitrary, and we may not be doing it correctly. But just to say that you got consent, not all consent is equal. Simply getting someone to say yes to something doesn't mean that they have been adequately informed and were capable of reasonably giving consent. So, I mean, that's where that kind of scenario falls apart.
Okay, let's raise the age a little bit. Let's say you were 16 or 17, and the person was 25 that they're having sex with.
Yeah.
Still?
Well, it depends. So this is another thing where there's a situation there. I think it's entirely possible that a 16 or 17-year-old could give informed consent to have sex with someone who is over 18. And I don't really think that the ages make a lot of difference, but there are extenuating circumstances where the nature of the relationship beforehand could have an impact on this. For example, if you're in a parent or custodial role and you have essentially trained them and raised them and brainwashed them to give consent to something they might not otherwise, that could be immoral. So you have to consider all of the factors in there. When we're talking about age of consent, there's obviously considerable disagreement, and it's changed over time. But
there's cases where it could be immoral even if they're both adults.
Yeah.
A lot of cases. So it's, we have to draw the line somewhere legally, but it's more circumstantial than
here's
that.
two 35-year-olds who are out and you got consent. Did you get consent? I mean, what are the situations? Can someone who's intoxicated actually be considered to give consent? Are they in their right mind? Are they able to make reasonable decisions? Probably not in most cases, depending on how, we're not just going to say, oh, somebody had a drink, so now they're incapable of reason.
Right.
But we know of situations where you can get air quotes consent, just in case you're not watching, which is not the same thing as consent. So that's why the laws that we have we don't just legislate on the basis of morality, but when we do, they're a lot more complex and muddier than just simplistic things, which is why I was advocating for situational morality. We went back to, is there an absolute with regard to, consent? And the answer is no, not a universal absolute.
So I know you don't have a lot of time left, but just really quick, I've been listening to a lot of Sam Harris, and he's been talking about determinism, and it's starting to change my worldview a lot. So, and I've had a hard time squaring determinism with morality. So,
normally the drawback for determinism for most people is what they think about free will. I would recommend reading Dan Dennett, and he's actually written a response to Sam Harris's article on free will, pointing out that Sam is essentially a determinist and he doesn't know it, a compatibilist and doesn't know it. But Dan has a really good book called Elbow Room: The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. There are also plenty of people who don't think that you have free will, and Sam is in a position where he rejects all notions of free will, and yet doesn't have a problem with considering moral questions, even in the absence of free will. Because at the end of the day, if I don't have any free will, and I don't think we have libertarian free will, and I'm generally a compatibilist, which is kind of a redefinition of free will. But John and I are sitting here, and let's say neither one of us have free will, and John decides to cut off my head. We'll flip the script so that I'm not always cutting off John's head. And neither one of us has free will. How does that change at all how we view that situation? We can say, oh, John wasn't responsible, but he was. This meat sack here, whether it was predetermined or whether it was an act of volition, still killed another meat sack, which is something we actually care about. And so we're going to hold him accountable. So at the end of the day, whether or not we have free will doesn't change how we're going to view and act with regard to moral dilemmas.
Yeah, and Sam Harris, he went into depth about that, and I don't know, something about it just doesn't make, not that it doesn't make sense, but I guess I'm just so used to viewing the world in a certain way. When I'm presented with that, I'm like, what? I'm not used to hearing this.
It's so strange stuff. It's strange stuff when you live in a world where the bulk of people believe that not only do they have free will, but they probably have libertarian free will, and they've been educated on morals and educated on dealing with these situations from an entirely religious perspective, a culture that has been soaked and steeped with religious traditions that don't actually map to reality. So there's a lot of thinking to do, but the things to ask yourself, if in fact you don't have free will, how does that change your life?
I guess it wouldn't really drastically change the way I view the world, I guess.
Yeah. I think the biggest fear people have is that, oh no, if people find out that they don't have free will, then there'll be mass chaos. That free will is an illusion that we need to keep, and I don't think that that's the case for free will or for anything.
Yeah.
To the extent that there's something useful about viewing the world with respect to free will, I think that still makes sense and exists whether we have it or not. Because there's a difference. I think you and I and everybody would agree that there's a difference between me standing up and walking outside of my own volition, whether it's free will or not, and John dragging me outside. And the difference between those two things is what we're addressing, whether anybody has anything called or like free will or not.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just a weird thing to think about when you're used to, I'm not religious, but I'm used to the religious idea of, I shouldn't say religious idea, but this idea of
it's traditional.
Free will. We just, everything we do is by our own choice. We kill someone just because we chose to do it. That's what our legal system is based off of, the notion that we make our own choices, not that we were predisposed to kill or rape someone.
But you could change it. You could change the way you think about it without changing anything else, which is I am a thinking agent, whether or not all my actions are predetermined or not. I am this meat sack doing actions. It doesn't matter whether or not that was predetermined. The difference, which is why I use that example of walking out versus being dragged out, is whether or not what you would have done is violated by some coercion or action by other thinking agents. Now, there's a lot of really good things that Sam goes into with regard to if we find out that there's a brain defect, that makes somebody, and then you get rid of the brain tumor. I would argue that is now a different person, just like I'm a different person now than I was when I was 10. I had a conversation with somebody the other day about statute of limitations. For some crimes, it's like 7 years. And the thought was, why should we have a statute of limitations? Why not, if we found out you stole that thing, why shouldn't we be able to prosecute you forever? I think one of the things is that we have limited resources, so how many crimes are we going to go after? But the other is, I did things when I was in my teens and 20s that I should have gone to jail for had I been caught. And the recognition that I'm a different person now and the fear of that consequence is what has kept me from, I have never repeated those acts at all and wouldn't, and discourage other people. So if I was now subjected to going to jail for whatever I did back then, what good does that serve anybody? It doesn't serve anybody anything. I should still be able to perhaps make restitution for things that I've done. But as far as, criminal code violations, there's reasons. We recognize that we change as people. And if you have somebody who's a serial offender who isn't changing, who is continuing to do the things, well then, they're going to end up in jail eventually. Hopefully. But
I think that analogy falls apart in certain areas. Because I know the statute of limitations, at least in some states, for rape is really short, maybe 6 years, something like that.
So the length of time is based in part upon the severity of the incident and the tenacity of evidence. So, for example, murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. You find the body, boom, you killed somebody. You're gonna, and that's not what I did, by the way. So I'm not everything that I did.
You didn't find the body?
Yeah, no, everything that I've done.
You didn't chop somebody's head off, for example.
Anyway, Jamar, I appreciate the call. Thanks so much. We're going to let you go, and we're going to cut out of here. As a reminder,